Thank you all for coming today. My name is Olaf Kalki, and the title of my presentation today is America's First Public Lodge, Anti-Masonry, Massachusetts State Law, in the Building of the Boston Masonic Temple, 1830 to 1832. What I'm going to do today is to give this presentation in a very specific format, and that is I'm going to read it. The reason for reading this presentation is very simple, and that is that after the Boston Masonic Temple was built and completed in 1832, it housed a very large number of events, most of them lectures, and traditionally back then the lectures were read. So to honor the tradition of Ralph Waldo Emerson and many others that lectured in his building, I would also like to read my presentation here tonight. So here we go. On May 30th, Unitarian minister and prominent Freemason Bernard Whitman closed his address. Brethren, with approving consciences and appealing to the Searcher of hearts for the purity of our intentions, let us now proceed to the closing act of consecration. We dedicate this Masonic Temple to the glory of the Supreme Architect of the universe. Here may he be worshipped in spirit and truth. Here may he shed down the richest of spiritual blessings. We dedicate it to intellectual improvement. Here may the wise freely impart their knowledge. Here may the young be qualified for distinguished usefulness. We dedicate it to social enjoyment. Here may no uncharitableness be felt or manifested. Here may the cords of brotherly love be strengthened. We dedicate it to practical charity. Here may the claims of the destitute be stated and realized. Here may the streams of benevolence rise and flow forth to gladden many hearts. We dedicate it to moral advancement. May the duties that we owe ourselves, our fellow men, our country, and our Father be here urged upon all. Here may the resolutions to live sober, righteous and godly lives be formed and strengthened. We dedicate it to the hope of immortality. Here may the sprig of cassia ever flourish. Here may we all be aided in our preparation to celebrate forever the praises of God and the Lamb. Whitman's words concluded a lengthy speech that was published the same year as a 44-page book, and marked the end of a 30-year struggle of the fraternity of ancient, free, and accepted Masons to establish their first own building in the city of Boston. Built between 1830 and 1832, the Boston Masonic Temple represents a radical departure from other buildings created by this American fraternity. Rather than being exclusively private space, this temple was created as a multi-use facility that merged the private character of lodge rooms with the public nature of large lecture halls. Masonic activities on one floor were complemented by the public function of the temple on another. The goal of this presentation is to examine two aspects of this, for its time, highly unusual multi-purpose project, and to uncover the complex acts of spatial negotiation that ultimately led to the completion of the building. First, I would like to argue in this paper here that the building must be understood as an intent to allow the Masonic fraternity to survive in times of adversity. From 1826 on, an intense anti-Masonic campaign had crippled the organization's spiritual practices and restricted its legal status, forcing it to look for an affordable building and more diverse income sources. For the several existing Masonic lodges in the city of Boston, the oldest of which dates back to 1733, the building thus constitutes what I call a spatial fixing, a new era of geographic stability for the relatively mobile fraternity that was forced to move between several rental facilities prior to 1830. The purchase of a building and the property ownership provided a private space for the persecuted fraternity to practice its own rituals at a time of intense scrutiny and slander. Second, I contend that the building constitutes an attempt to make virtue out of necessity by intentionally creating a space that would be, on the one hand, contesting its Masonic function, but on the other hand, provide a collaborative space where the philosophical and spiritual ideas of Freemasonry coexisted with many other radical ideas of its time. As I will show in this paper, the building attracted a number of rental clients who utilized the lecture hall, dining room, and schoolrooms for the dissemination of their often no less radical or controversial ideas. By the time the legal restrictions on Freemasonry were beginning to be lifted in 1841, the Boston Masonic Temple had become a sought-after social venue that had housed an experimental school, provided home for the American Lyceum movement, and had given emerging scholars, such as Ralph Waldo Emerson, a platform for their radical theology, allowing him to launch his career as a writer and as a public speaker. In summary, what I'll uncover here is how an act of persecution was turned into a creative act of resistance. In the transition period between the alehouse lodge and the temple buildings solely dedicated to Freemasonry, Boston's Freemasons effectively created a public temple that allowed for both private ceremonies and simultaneously capitalized on the public trends of the time. Freemasons needed the public that shunned it to survive, and cleverly invited other disenfranchised groups to use their space. The historical origins of Freemasonry are the subject of much debate. Facts and myths regarding its origins are often hard to distinguish, and a coherent reconstruction of its organization is impossible before the 18th century. Some scholars link the origins of the fraternity to the operative stonemason guilds of the 8th century, while others dispute these early origins and instead explain the emergence of the Brotherhood as a result of a transition process that occurred sometime in the 17th century, involving a movement from operative to speculative, in other words, to a philosophically and morally guided guild. Yet others view Freemasonry as a continuation of the medieval Knights Templar order, or link it to the creation of the Royal Society or the Rosicrucian movement of the 17th century. What is known and recorded is that modern Freemasonry dates back to 1717, when 4 London lodges agreed to form the Grand Lodge of England. From there, it quickly spread to continental Europe and to the New World. It only took 3 years before the first Masonic Lodge meetings were held by British settlers in Boston, but the first chartered lodge, given full authority to practice in the new territories, was St. John's Lodge in Boston on July 30th, 1733. Such permissions to charter a lodge were given by a number of Grand Lodges. In the United States, many lodges were created under the authority of the Grand Lodge of England, yet others were authorized by the Grand Lodges of Ireland or a competitor organization to the Grand Lodge of England, the ancient Grand Lodge of England. Furthermore, we see the beginning of provincial Grand Lodges in the United States that exercised their own authority given by the Grand Lodge of England. The first provincial Grand Masters were given authority over New York, New Jersey, and Pennsylvania, and Boston respectively. With the independence of the United States, all jurisdiction or authority over individual lodges was gradually transferred from the European Grand Lodges to the Grand Lodges in each state. The Revolutionary War not only solidified American independence, it also freed American Freemasonry from continental authority. Throughout the 18th and 19th century, Freemasonry experienced considerable popularity, and the organization became firmly established as an American institution. Estimates put the number of Freemasons in the United States at over 100,000 by the year 1826, the year that would fundamentally alter the landscape of the fraternity. The city of Boston, of course, played a key role in the American Revolution and became home of one of the largest concentrations of Freemasons in America. In the city of Boston alone, with its urban population somewhere between 60,000 in 1820 and over 80,000 by 1830, at least 5 lodges had been established by 1826, with a total membership of about 6,000 men. Throughout the late 1700s and early 1800s, Boston's Freemasons, like so many of their brothers across the country, met in a variety of venues. While the earliest Masonic temple building in the United States dates back to 1785, the majority of Freemasons at this point in time met in diverse accommodations, ranging from rooms above pubs to rented facilities in state-owned buildings. William Moore, quoting a Masonic reporter in 1870, writes that, quote, previous to 1826, the majority of country lodges were held in taverns. Generally, the upper room or ballroom was reserved for that purpose. During the second third of the 19th century, however, Masonic ritual became both increasingly standardized and solemn. As a result, it was removed from the public realm and enacted in private spaces called lodge rooms, specifically to house its performance, end quote. In large part, this was due to the lack of uniformity in Masonic ritual, which would only gradually become codified after 1813. Prior to this date, a number of grand lodges and rites issued and utilized different rituals. But beginning that year, and before that with the creation of the Grand Lodge of England, a new uniform set of rituals with a more coherent story would evolve and codify rituals, constitutions, rules, degrees, and initiation ceremonies. In Boston, this move out of the alehouses and into the temples, and from disorganized ritual to formalized instruction, began as early as 1803. On December 12, 1803, the Grand Lodge of Massachusetts appointed a committee to, quote, devise ways and means to erect a hall for the use of the Grand Lodge, end quote, and its constituent bodies. Simultaneously, this group of Freemasons decided at this point in time to apply for a legal recognition of the Grand Lodge as a charitable corporation, which would have allowed it to own property and capital. Grand Lodge records indicate that the committee did not follow through on its charge, and no action was taken. 6 years later on the day, on December 12, 1809, the committee was again charged to procure the rights for the Grand Lodge to secure land and the building for its constituent lodge. But after another unsuccessful year with no actions taken, the committee was finally dismissed by the Grand Master Isaiah Thomas. The denial to achieve incorporation is perhaps not surprising, since it was relatively rare to do so in the early 1800s. Most businesses were run by sole proprietors and limited partnerships, and were based on small-scale production. The beginning of the Industrial Revolution and the availability of technology for mass production, however, facilitated a need to pool large amounts of capital for the purchase of equipment. In Massachusetts, the state Supreme Court decision of Vose versus Grant in 1818 laid the foundation for the introduction of limited liability, and thus the establishment of large-scale corporations. Furthermore, all incorporations had to be approved by the state legislature back then, rather than by registering and paying a fee at local authorities. As the fraternity and the city of Boston were growing rapidly in the first 2 decades of the 1800s, it's perhaps not surprising that the incorporation of the Grand Lodge of Massachusetts was approved by the state legislature even before the 1819 developments. On June 16, 1817, the Master Ward of the Grand Lodge of Massachusetts were incorporated and given authority to both own property and hold personal estate. Specifically, the Act stated that the possession of property would not be exceeding $20,000, and personal estate no larger than $60,000 may be held by the fraternity. You can see that on the slide in front of you. Following this new freedom to explore property ownership, extenuating circumstances led the Grand Lodge of Massachusetts to charge yet another committee on December 28, 1818, with finding a permanent home for all Masonic organizations. The Exchange Coffee House, which you can see on the slide here, one of the many temporary locations in the Boston area that served the Grand Lodge of Massachusetts and several other lodges, burned down in a spectacular fire on November 3rd, 1818. Beyond simply leaving the organization homeless again, this ousting for the first time confronted the fraternity with the limitations of its new and recently achieved legal status. Rather than seeking to rent yet another facility, 5 prominent Boston Freemasons were appointed with a task to find an affordable property, and they identified Merchants Hall as being for sale. 2 problems arose in the consideration of this building, though. First, its property value would have exceeded the limit of $20,000 that was set at the time for charitable corporations. Hence, the fraternity considered purchasing the building, but making it a mixed-use site that would be held jointly with a commercial corporation owned by Boston entrepreneurs Thomas K. Jones, William D. Hahn, and Thomas Brown. Second, the building would have required major renovations in order to make it usable by the fraternity. This required another $13,000 for such a project, in addition to the purchase price, and exceeded the resources of the Grand Lodge of Massachusetts. And even a major fundraising push could not generate enough resources to ensure the successful acquisition of a permanent home for the fraternity. Again, the homeless organization opted for a series of temporary homes before a new push towards property acquisition could occur. Following the loss of accommodations at the Exchange Coffee House in 1818, the Grand Lodge and several of its constituent Boston lodges held their meetings in Concert Hall and in Masons Hall on St. Anne Street. You can see that this building in particular was shared with the Oddfellows fraternity. In 1821, then, the fraternity moved to the Old State House, and both the Grand Lodge of Massachusetts and several Boston lodges would hold their meetings there until 1830. Prior to the move to the First Masonic Temple in 1832, the Old State House thus provided the most stable accommodations in a long time. While the fraternity also briefly inhabited Washington Hall from the late 1820s to mid 1831, and from late 1830 to mid 1831, it is during the time in the Old State House that the preparations for the First Masonic Temple were made. Unfortunately, it is also during this time of stability and growth that the fraternity experienced its most serious challenge to its existence, and its legal rights were seriously curtailed. Let me elaborate. In 1825, the fraternity was preparing to purchase land and consider the building of its own temple. All previous attempts to purchase existing buildings and to refurbish them for Masonic uses had either proven to be too expensive, or the interior spaces were of such dimensions that they could not be converted for Masonic use and accommodate enough brothers. Thus, on December 27, 1825, yet another committee was charged with, quote, procuring a permanent place for the meetings of the Grand Lodge. A year later, on December 27, 1826, a vote was passed by the Grand Lodge renewing this charge, and the treasurer of the Grand Lodge of Massachusetts added a sense of urgency to it, stating that, quote, a want of funds has been a great embarrassment to the enterprise, end quote, yet expressing that hope that, quote, a Masonic temple will soon be erected by this Grand Lodge, end quote. Shortly thereafter, on April 2nd, 1827, the Grand Lodge of Massachusetts was able to purchase land on the corner of Tremont Street and Temple Place, right next to St. John's. Following this initial purchase, however, another 3 years and additional property purchases would pass before the cornerstone of the building on this site would be laid, and it would be May 30th, 1832, before the completion and dedication of the First Masonic Temple. Between 1827 and 1832, an unforeseen development impacted the activities of the fraternity and did not only slow down the progress towards completion of this project, but almost completely derailed the start of the construction project at all. The event in question here is known today as the Morgan Affair. William Morgan, that you can see on this slide here, was a somewhat enigmatic figure, and many details of his life remain unknown. What we do know is that he was born in Virginia sometime between 1774 and 1776, served as a soldier in the War of 1812, and worked in a variety of trades across the eastern United States and Canada before settling at Batavia, New York, to work as a stonemason. While there is some considerable debate about Morgan's membership in the Masonic fraternity, what is known is that he befriended some disgruntled former Freemasons in his adopted hometown, and in 1826 signed an agreement with a local publisher to work on an expose of Masonic ritual. This expose you can actually see right here. Following the delivery of the manuscript, his troubles began. First, he was arrested for an unpaid debt and later accused of fraud. On both occasions, he was released from prison on bail paid by Freemasons. Shortly thereafter, he mysteriously disappeared and was never to be seen again. A body was later found, but it could never be conclusively linked to Morgan. The circumstances of his early, repeated arrests and the fact that he was about to publish a book that described Masonic ritual in detail were enough to point suspicions to the Masonic fraternity. Within months, anti-Masonic fervor swept across the state of New York and into Massachusetts. Local and national anti-Masonic organizations and parties were formed, and a series of legal acts against Freemasons were implemented by state governments. As Locke states, quote, in 1827, these malignant features of anti-Masonry appeared in Massachusetts. In the years following, it was rampant in politics and in churches and in country towns, assuming a distinct form of party organization, end quote. Massachusetts citizens elected a number of anti-Masons to the legislature, which shortly thereafter passed a law, quote, making it a criminal offense for any person to administer or take an extrajudicial oath. Following the law and honoring the tradition that Masonic initiation requires a solemn oath, the record of Massachusetts Lodge in the city of Boston, for example, indicates that it did not raise any new members between the years of 1829 and 1841. Despite, or perhaps of this, immediate impact on membership, Massachusetts Freemasons nevertheless continued in their quest to build their temple. 3 years after the initial purchase of the property in the city, in September 1830, a Grand Lodge committee, after examining many lots of land, selected a site that from the portions of the state then known as Washington Gardens, and further funds were approved to allow for the constructions of the building on this site. Just a month later, on October 14, 1830, the cornerstone of the First Masonic Temple in Boston was laid after a public procession from Faneuil Hall to the construction site on Tremont Street. While the first lodge meetings were already being held in the building in late 1831, the official dedication and opening of the building did not occur until May 30th, 1832, during which Bernard Whitman spoke the words that I opened my presentation with. Ultimately succeeding in the completion of the temple, the years between the selection of the site, the cornerstone laying, and the dedication illustrate the strong anti-Masonic sentiments that prevailed in Boston at the time. First, there was public dissent and slander. Hurd, for example, argued that, quote, such was the excited state of the public feeling at this time against Freemasonry that it was no holiday affair to take part in public Masonic services. It required no small degree of backbone to stand up under the insults and jeers which Masons were then assailed with in public and in private, end quote. Second, and perhaps most importantly, the completion of the temple, in spite of public resistance against it, created a significant legal problem for the fraternity. As described above, the Act of Incorporation from 1817 limited the fraternity to holding property valued $20,000 or less. As the building was constructed, it became quickly obvious that additional funds were needed. The Grand Lodge borrowed money from Harvard College. Altogether the building cost was to be estimated $45,000 now, more than 2 times as much as the fraternity was allowed to hold. Subsequently, in 1831, a petition was submitted to the legislature to modify the Act of Incorporation from 1817. Rather than $20,000 in real estate and $60,000 in personal estate, the Grand Lodge requested to hold a maximum of $60,000 in real estate and $20,000 in personal property. In other words, it wanted to reverse the terms here. As Heard again states, quote, "The prayers of the petitioners was rejected," as you can see on this slide here. At this time, the political anti-Masonry had arrived at its culminating point, and such was the bitterness and malignity with which the opponents of the craft were governed, that not only was this most reasonable request refused, but they even threatened to deprive the fraternity of their chartered privileges, end quote. Not only was their incorporation almost revoked by the legislature, but their request to shift their resources to more property and less personal estate was denied by the legislature, posing an immediate problem. The property to be completed would be illegal for the fraternity to own. So what they had just invested in was all of a sudden illegal. In response, they voluntarily surrendered their corporate rights and sold the building in 1833 to one of their brothers, Robert G. Shaw, who in 1835 again transferred ownership, this time to a board of 5 trustees, all Boston Freemasons, who held the building for the fraternity until it was sold to the U.S. government in 1858. In other words, almost immediately after the temple had been financed and built by the fraternity, it had to give up its legal rights as a charitable corporation and could not hold property. It had to rely on the benevolence and trust of a few selected brothers to hold the newly completed building in trust. The success of the fraternity in maintaining the building between 1832 and 1858, during which it became a staple of Boston nightlife, is perhaps hard to comprehend given this history of struggle. But it began in December 1826 in response to the Morgan affair, when Grand Treasurer of the Grand Lodge of Massachusetts, Elijah Morse, expressed his confidence that for the building of a temple, quote, "subordinate lodges would be pleased to invest a portion of their funds in the undertaking, on being satisfied that the investment would be secure and provide a good income," end quote. Beyond providing a home for the fraternity after years of moves, the temple was to create an income source for the struggling group. With membership stagnant after 1829, the completion of the temple was paramount, not only because the building was needed by the homeless organization, but because it planned to use it as an investment by creating a multi-use facility. This is perhaps not surprising, since the organization itself had survived in multi-use facilities for years and shared spaces with businesses and other fraternal organizations, such as the Odd Fellows, as you've seen in the previous slide. In the interest of time here, I will not elaborate much more on the details of the second part of my paper that describes the interactions of the fraternity with its tenants in the building, but what I do want to do is give you a quick impression of how the temple was designed as a multi-use facility and who utilized the temple in those days. The temple was built as a multi-story facility with a lodge room on the top floor, complete with offices for the individual lodges that were using the facility. On the remaining floor, a large lecture hall, another hall that was often used for dining, and a basement, and basement accommodations for schoolrooms could be found. According to the plans laid out by the Grand Lodge of Massachusetts, on at least 3 nights a week, the temple would be open for public events, including lectures, discussions, and dinners. Subsequently, a long list of organizations utilized the temple, among them the Society for the Diffusion of the Mechanics Society, the American Lyceum Movement, and the Franklin Lectures Committee, to name just a few. All of these organizations offered educational programs at a time when Americans hungered for knowledge, and the lecture became an important, if not central, element of the public sphere. As Donald Scott states, the lecture was, quote, expected to incorporate the public, to embrace all members of the community, whatever their occupation, social standing, or political religious affiliation. Useful to all and offensive to none, the lecture was an oratorical form deliberately and carefully separated from all partisan and sectarian discourse. Finally, the lecture was delivered in at least neutral, if not clearly designed, public space, usually the town hall or another auditorium of sufficient size to accommodate all who may wish to attend." End quote. Events at the temple often included a dinner, thus offering a night out in town for many of Boston's citizens. What my research further elaborates is the relationship between radical religious movements of the time and Freemasonry, which no doubt resulted in the fact that the new temple offered a safe place for emerging scholars to express their ideas. As Horowitz brilliantly argues in his book on Occult America, the 1820s to 1860s marked a period in American history during which our fellow citizens were fascinated by a variety of spiritual traditions, ranging from the occult, psychics, and Eastern religions to Hela Blavatsky's theosophy. In the 1840s and 1850s, the Boston Masonic Temple, as the home for an ecumenically oriented, some might say deist fraternity that shunned dogma and embraced esoterical ideas, became the home of many radical spiritual thinkers that challenged the church dogma of the day. Perhaps the most well-known of such thinkers is Ralph Waldo Emerson, who began lecturing in the temple as early as 1835 and gave many of his most famous orations in the building. In addition, the temple served as a playground for pedagogical experiments of the day, namely by housing the temple school that you can see in this slide here. And the temple school was Bronson Alcott, Elizabeth Peabody, and Margaret Fuller's experiment with progressive pedagogy in a co-ed school that in 1839 also admitted a first female mixed-race student. In summary, the building of the Masonic Temple must be understood within the historical context of a radical religious shift in American society. What I hope to have shown here is that Freemasonry, as a fraternal organization under oppression, gathered other sympathetic movements and created a public forum for radical thought. It was the popularity of American Transcendentalism and Ralph Waldo Emerson that provided such new income source. Representatives of this new spiritual movement found a home for their regular public lectures in the Masonic Temple. An intense philosophical dialogue between Freemasons and Transcendentalists emerged. It enriched both spiritual traditions as well as secured the financial stability of the fraternity. In my next presentation, I will focus exactly on this relationship between Freemasons and Transcendentalists and talk a little bit more and elaborate more on this relationship between Emerson and the Freemasons. Most importantly, I will also draw on some of the parallels in Masonic philosophy and the actual work of Ralph Waldo Emerson to show the striking similarities in these kinds of ways of thinking. Thank you for attending tonight.